Okay, well, you are listening to the Lament of Hope podcast, and I am here today with Aileen Challies. She is here, and she's the wife of Tim Challies, who wrote Seasons of Sorrow. Um, Aileen, just to kind of start out, can you tell me if you wrote a book on your life, what do you think you'd call it?
Um, that was actually a difficult question for me to answer, to be honest with you, because I think so often the concept of ordinary um, has already been talked about a ton, right? Ordinary woman, that would definitely be me. God's been incredibly faithful. So I think that's probably where I would go with it. The idea of, ordinary woman, extraordinary God has already been used, but I think that that's probably an apt title as well.
Why would you call it that?
Um, because I think I am ordinary. There's nothing extraordinary about who I am or what I do. And yet God has been incredibly faithful in my life. Um, and he has stayed with me through good, bad, difficult. And I think that kind of encapsulates it all very nicely.
What do you think for you has been being a woman walking with the Lord? What do you think has been the most challenging thing being a woman? Because especially now in the time we live, it's really complicated as to what a woman is. And I know for me personally, as I've been walking with the Lord, I find it hard even to know, what is a woman supposed to look like? Like you have Proverbs 31,
Mm.
which describes what the Proverbs 31 woman's supposed to be, the godly woman. And yet there's so many areas where you're like, well, I'm not that great at that, or I don't know how to sew. And so it's kind of like there can be discouragement about what it means to be a woman. So when you're talking about being ordinary and that is something that you're content with and that's who you are, what do you mean by that? How is that something that is encouraging to you?
So generationally, I'm a little different than you. I'm a little bit older than you are. And so when I was first married, I was saved at 19. And I was coming out of a non-Christian background. And so consequently, I was being taught what a wife does. And so my mom was a stay-at-home mom, which was fantastic. And I determined I wanted to do that too. But I would say that homemaking is not something that necessarily comes naturally to me. I don't sew. I like to cook, but I didn't back then. And some women take a ton of joy out of cleaning, and that is definitely not who I am. And so I was in a house raising my kids, and yet never really feeling like I fit in that well with your typical concept of motherhood and homemaking and everything else. And it took a lot of years before I realized that the Lord doesn't necessarily call you to specific tasks within that. So I don't have to sew to be a good Christian mother. But there's other tasks that he does call me to, and based on my strengths and my giftings. And so I often I always have projects on outside of the house in order to keep me occupied. And that was a huge gift for me that I came to realize that because I think I could have spent a lot of years lamenting what I wasn't. Um, and I did. And then eventually came to a point where I'm much more content in who I am now and who God has created me to be. So
How did you work through that as you were struggling with comparison or thinking about ways that you could be better or what you believed a woman should be like?
so I'm not terribly introspective. I'm I'm very black and white. So I don't often look inside and battle through things the way that I hear other people do. Um, and so I think it was just a growing contentment in who I was. So I don't know that it was this massive introspection project, reading tons of books, and it's just not who I am. And that's that's okay. So I think honestly, I don't have a great answer for that. I think it was just a really long process of becoming content with who I am and understanding that, okay, my life and I'm happier and my life works better if I'm doing these things that don't necessarily look what your typical motherhood would look like. So
What do you for life for you, what has been um the most beautiful or like meaningful aspect of life? Like what makes it beautiful to you?
friends, family, and church is the easy answer, but it's the truth answer. The relationships that you create with, not just within your family, but also within your church family, is so important. And that really is what makes life work. It's walking with people through difficult times, walking with them through the good times, and just truly knowing and being with people. And that's really the heart of what makes life beautiful.
Do you remember like a really when you're talking about your family community, do you have like a meaningful memory that kind of encapsulates that? Um,
Mm.
that's something that was very touching to you and
So
encouraging.
not specifically, because I think there's a sense in which it is the mundane that makes it work, right? So there is obviously my son's death was huge in terms of community, um, not just my church community, but also my neighborhood community who are not Christian coming together and rallying around us through that. So
Mm.
if you're wanting a big picture of that, then sure, that would be one. But a lot of it has been the subsequent mundaneness of it with our small group and helping, just being there for each woman as they struggle through just difficulties of life in this world. And it doesn't have to be major. It's everything from your kids not sleeping to something larger, right? But it's just the mundane of life and just being in those trenches with people, um, for sure.
How you're referring, I know, to your son's death. What do you think is what is the hardest thing you've gone through? And then how did you go through that with the Lord? Because I think one of the hardest things about being a believer, for me personally, is that like when you go through hard things, it's walking through them with the Lord and still believing his promises, even if you can't see them in like a tangible way or how you
Right.
want to see them. Um, so how did you do that and walk through that yourself?
So it's, if you trace it back, the Lord prepared me when I first became a Christian for Nick's death. And how he did that was through giving me an incredible foundation. We were in a Dutch Reformed church at the time, and I was 19 years old, and they didn't quite know what to do with me because they hadn't had a lot of converts, adult converts. So they had me going to the catechism classes with the teenagers, and I would sit through those catechism classes, and I learned a foundation of faith that began right then and there, and it centered on God's sovereignty. And so it came down when Nick died. Either honestly, either all of this is true or none of it is true, and we have to trust in God's sovereignty. And even when it doesn't feel like it, you have to trust that it's true, and then assume eventually that your emotions are going to catch up to the reality. And that's really ultimately what it came down to. The Lord knew that the Lord is good, and we had to trust in his sovereignty and his character. And even though none of it felt true, we had to know it was true. And then slowly everything comes back into alignment. It takes a long time, but things come back into alignment.
What was the lamenting process for you before you kind of were able to get to, because as you said, healing process takes a long time. So how did you work through your strong emotions and your sorrows then?
So every person's different. And I think in large part that's because every circumstance is different, every death is different, every person's relationship with the deceased is different. There's no constant with it. Anytime we've talked to other parents who have lost children, the there's none that are the same. Each manner of death is different. Each relationship is so different. So I wanted to start off by saying that because I think so often it's easy to want to put grief in a box, and it's not really that simple, unfortunately. There's no easy ABC to get through grief. There just isn't. Um, so my husband wrote a book. That's how he grieved. For me, I had to look at it in tiny little increments. I couldn't focus on it or it would have destroyed me. So I had to kind of glance at it. And then well, this is how we sort of describe it. I would glance at it and then I'd look away and I would do just about anything else. I was working, I would watch shows. I would just sort of distract myself and then eventually come back to it again and then look away again. And I'm still to some degree doing that, I would think. I don't think I have fully processed it completely, not the way Tim has. But my way I process, the way I deal is very different than my husband's. And that's okay. And that's good. And I'm a very different person. And I know my limitations with everything. So it's such a long process.
What were your conversations like with the Lord through it?
Hmm. So I think in the beginning, we relied on other people praying for us
Yeah.
and other people's conversations with the Lord because I wasn't in a position to have it. I was able to say, Lord, I know that this was your right and I trust you in it. But then he hurt me, really, he did. And in that decision. And so there felt for a long time like there was a broken trust. Like I was scared he was going to hurt me again, frankly. There is that element to it. And so you have to kind of, how do you repair a relationship with someone who is able, how do you repair a relationship with God that way, right? Like he can't communicate directly to you the way that I would if I were to apologize to you. And so it was slowly getting back into scripture and slowly, I hadn't, my faith wasn't gone. There was just this sort of trying to figure out what the new was going to look like to some degree
Hmm.
in it all.
I was actually in our small group the other day. We were having we were talking about being angry at God. We were going through. We just finished Lamentations, and there's just these moments in Lamentations where the people, like, of course, of their own sin are suffering, but they're angry and hurt because the suffering is so long and so prolonged, and they're in a lot of pain. And we were talking about whether or not anger at God is something you can do without sinning. Some people said no, to be angry at God is to sin. And then other people said no, I believe being angry at God is just human emotion and you should talk to him about it. And I don't think it's a sin. Um, did you experience any anger with the Lord as you saw something, like you said, someone you loved is suddenly gone and you didn't really have a chance to even, say goodbye or prepare for it in a sense? Were you ever angry at God, and how did you reconcile that in your mind? Like, do you think in your walk with the Lord it's okay to be angry at God?
So I didn't. And if you know me, you'll know how truly miraculous that is in some ways. If you had told me 5 years ago that this would happen and I wouldn't be angry at God, I don't know that I would have believed you.
Hmm.
So in his mercy and his grace, I was not angry at him.
Right.
And I don't believe it's okay to be angry at God. He is, I understand it fully, that emotion, but I'm not sure that we are allowed to be, because doing that would deny that he was right to do what he did. And he was.
Mm.
So he was right. And like, because he cannot make a mistake. And therefore we don't have that right. I don't believe. So it's I have a great deal of sympathy for people who are having said that because I know how hard it is when your emotions get involved with stuff, to not react emotionally.
When when you I know you mentioned at the beginning, you said people would be praying for you for a while because you couldn't really say much beyond just really simple prayers. Um, was there a time when you had a lengthy conversation with God about it for the first time?
I don't remember, to be honest with you. It's going to be 3 years this November. And um, one of the bizarre aspects of grief is that my memory is completely shot for a fair bit of that time. I
Hmm.
don't remember much for the first 3 months, and I remember very little for the first six. And so, and then it just slowly starts coming back. So I'm sure if there's a doctor somewhere who could talk about the brain protection that happens through that sort of trauma. I'm sure it has something to do with that, but I don't, and I haven't had my memories come back, which I am immensely thankful for, to be honest. But I know
Hmm.
some people do have that. I just personally don't. So
And so, um, what do you think the meaning of life is?
I think ultimately we're put on this earth to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. And so, really, that is essentially what the meaning of life is. It's we're put on this earth to glorify God, and everything else flows out of that.
What is that like in your walk with the Lord through the years? How have you grown in your like like knowing Him? Because like you become saved and you're coming to know the Lord. But as the years pass, the hope is that as you're being sanctified, you know Him more and more as He is.
Mhm.
How have you seen that in your life?
I think I tend to rely on other people who knew me before to point out the change in me, because I don't know that I'm that great at, like, the changes are often minuscule, right? And so I think for me, I definitely rely on my husband um, to tell me the growth he sees most in me. Um, yeah, and I can't pull stuff off the top of my head right now to give you concrete examples of things. I mean, I'm more mellow than I used to be, which is fantastic. So that's definitely an area of growth. I tend to be sort of type A before, so things are a little smoother now. Um, yeah, sorry, I'm not going to give you a great answer for that question.
No, you're good. Is there a scripture verse that means a lot to you?
Um, I think Psalm 23 is just because I can pull it off the top of my head easily, especially after Nick died. So that one, you hear it all the time, right? And then once you go walk through something like that, those verses become very personal in a lot of ways. So um, it's probably at the moment, to be honest, it does change from time to time too.
Yeah. Is there like a song um that means a lot to you or it's very soulful for you? It's either, really just resonates with who you are as a person, or just a song that's meant a lot to you in any time, when Nick died or even now, a song that really is close to you.
So, fun fact, I am tone deaf. So I don't hear music at all. And music has never interested me, never. I couldn't tell you. I mean, I love singing in church, to be clear. I love worshiping. But in terms of that sort of thing, yes, no, I'm afraid
E-
not.
Tone deaf meaning like you can't hear music?
So I can hear music, obviously. What I can't do is if you were to play two notes next to each other on a keyboard, I couldn't tell you that there's a difference between the two of them.
Oh, okay. So I guess
It
you're
was actually
not part of a worship band.
No, definitely not. No, no. And it's even funny, we hear it in other things. So if a child's crying, parents can pick out their kid's cry based on being able to hear the tone of the cry. I can't. Somebody starts crying, I immediately assume it's my child, and everyone's looking at me like I'm nuts. But no, so it was awkward when my children were little as well, because I just always assumed that they were crying and they weren't always. It could have been another child and I wouldn't hear it.
Is that like, has that always been the case or?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is there something? ever, and I want to, I know because you were saying too that you don't think as much of an abstract way, which is like, that's a good thing in some ways too. Um, is there something in your, like in your community, or something about the world at large that you wish you could change if you could?
Um, I mean, aside from the obvious of no sin, peace in the world, all those other things, I'm really quite content, to be honest with you. I think the Lord has placed us on this earth in this sort of situation for a reason. And while we can do our best with what He's given us, I don't know that I often wish for other things, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I'm pretty content with. I mean, I don't know really what you're asking, to be honest with you. Like, are you asked like global scale, no war, right? That sort of thing. If you're talking like more of a microcosm, I'm quite content with the way that my life is right now, and where God has me.
Have you always been like, has contentment been something that you found relatively easy to experience, or did you grow in that?
No, so I would fight circumstance a whole heck of a lot. And this may be a result of Nick, to be honest with you, and just realizing that there's far worse that can happen, frankly. So I would say when I had little kids, and even to some degree, yeah, let's just stick it there. So when I had little kids and stuff, I definitely was fighting for contentment a lot more
Hmm.
um, than I am now. And I mean, that probably is just a process of sanctification and the Lord working a lot of things out in my heart. Um, yeah.
What was particularly challenging? Is it because it was just challenging having little kids and that would come out more for the contentment? Or is it because you couldn't do the things you used to be able to do super easily? Or,
Yeah, I would say, I mean, it's just plain hard having little ones. And there's always a sense with kids that you feel like you're constantly failing. And that was just never, I was always sort of striving for excellence in everything I do. And so then when you feel
hmm,
like you're not doing well in it, which I mean, you never do with children, it's just, I mean, some people might, most people I know don't. And so consequently, it was just a really hard space to constantly be living in, to constantly feel like you were not doing well at what God has called you to do ultimately, right?
mhm,
And
yeah.
so you're thinking, well, why in earth, Lord, have you called me to do this when I'm not very good at it, it seems. So um
How did you get to a place of more contentment?
uh again, I wish I could give you an ABC on this one, but I can't. I think it was just, whoa. Um, I think it was just realizing and coming to an acceptance of this is where God has placed me, and understanding once again that God doesn't make mistakes. And so consequently, he's right and he's good, and this is where he needs me to be right now. So I think that really was that, just learning that or thinking through that process to some degree. And some of it was just sort of a natural flow. And it gets easier as your kids get older too, I find. Because you're not just like dog training, to be honest with you, when they're little. So that stage is harder.
Because I'm kind of fascinated because you talk about how before, when you were younger anyway, you were a more emotional person in the sense of feeling things very keenly when you're talking about fighting circumstance. And so it's encouraging to me because it's kind of my personality, but like trying to see where, how you grew in that. Because I've seen people who maybe like will just, a lot of people I know just walk away from the Lord when things get hard. They're just like, sorry. And it's discouraging if you're a young person because you're like, I really want to believe that like you can go through the worst possible thing in your life and you will still be able to believe in God and like not think he's against you, because to think God is against you is like there's no purpose to living anymore, because like if God's
Right.
against you, there's just no point. Nothing will make up for that to make it better. And um I'm just fascinated by that journey of being able to see, okay, this person like experienced hardship, but they didn't walk away from God and give up. But it seems like in the moment, especially from what I've personally experienced, it's like it seems so easy to give up. And there's the aspect of God's grace and his sustainment. But how do you not give up yourself, if that makes sense?
Yeah. And I think honestly, what it comes down to is having your theology right. So you can't prepare for grief when you're, or hardship or suffering when you're in the middle of it. You have to prepare before so that when you do end up in areas like that, you're simply deploying what you know to be true. And that definitely was what we were doing. It was that night we were simply, you could I just knew you were just deploying truth. You knew what was true. You were just deploying it, even if it didn't feel it. It was there to be able to give, versus trying to learn it in the midst of it. And I mean, people do, but again, I think that's going to be a whole heck of a lot harder, right? So, I mean, I spent oddly enough like an entire year in James prior, like a few years ago, but that was huge for me in terms of just knowing truth before difficulty came. So spending time in the word, spending time, I mean, regular church attendance, making sure you're sitting under the word constantly, all of these things. And then so that you're prepared for when something does happen. Because it's not an if, right? It's a when in this world. This world isn't made to have everything going swimmingly. And some people suffer more than others. I'm not saying everybody suffers at the same level by any stretch of the imagination, but you cannot get through life without something happening.
Hmm.
Um, so the importance of simply being able to deploy your theology when suffering comes is, I think that really is the key. And that certainly was the key for us. Um,
When your son died, was that the first time that you really felt like you were deploying those full force kind of thing? Was that the
yes.
first time you felt that way?
Yeah. And I think you have to be so careful not to compare, because the Lord hands people suffering based on what he's determined for them to go through. And for them, it feels just as real and difficult
Hmm.
as something major. And so, um, not to necessarily compare to the other things that were going on in our lives prior to when Nick passed away. But I mean, we had some things. My husband has some health issues and things like that that were really, really hard. So I had already been sort of practicing, if you will, deploying some of that, but certainly the level that was required was a little bit beyond anything we had done before. And so, yes, I would say um, that was the first time that we had to sort of full scale just completely let go and just trust God that He was good and right, and we were going to get through this. And yeah,
Was there, um, now when you think of it, or even more recently, because I know your memory going back to that period is not clear, probably for good. Um, what ways have you seen that the Lord's like been able to carry you? Because there's some days I think where you feel like the Lord's carrying you as opposed to you. It's just more tangibly felt that He's sustaining you in a specific day. Um,
yeah. So the most poignant moment I can come up with is that it's in Tim wrote about it. And it was the day that Nick was supposed to be married. He was engaged. He'd been engaged for 3 months before he passed away. And he was supposed to be married on May 8th. And so he died November 3rd. And we had gotten through the sort of winter season. And May 8th was just a tough day because it was mourning. I mean, you mourn the loss of what was, but then on May 8th, we were mourning what was supposed to happen in the future. And Tim and I were both just really having a hard day.
Mm.
And we went off to the cemetery to visit him. And we took our corsage with us. And we laid it out, and we were both just absolutely wrecked. And all of a sudden, we hear somebody say, "Are you Tim Challies?" And we look up and what the heck is this? And there was this gentleman standing there with his wife, and they had recognized, or they had obviously read Tim's blog a fair bit, and just offered to pray with us. And we explained to them what the day was, and they just sat down and prayed with us. And we had never seen them at the grave before. Their son was buried a couple rows up, actually, about the same age as Nick. And
Mm.
we haven't seen them since either. So it really felt like the Lord just provided that couple and allowed them to minister to us through prayer. And it was really in that moment that I felt for the first time in months that the Lord was directly caring for us.
Wow.
It was a really sweet moment, and I was very thankful in the hardship of that day that He had sent them. So,
Hmm. Have you been able to comfort at a new level to you the people that are around you who experience hardship or loss? Do you feel it more keenly on their behalf? Is it easier to empathize with what they're going through?
I think I've learned a lot about how to sit with somebody who's suffering.
Mm.
I think so often, even prior to this, I would be uh, very tempted to try to fix it or talk too much or, um, yeah, just be perhaps a little bit too forward with the way I was relating to people. And certainly, so much of it is just spending an awful lot of time and listening,
Mm.
praying with them, and then walking away because you can't fix this. And really, what people need most is to be heard, I think.
Mm.
And obviously, you give them truth in so much as you can, but simple truth, nothing complex, because their brains can't. Their brains can't absorb it at this point.
Mm.
And so I think I was never very good at it before. I was afraid, I think, a lot of people's sorrow before,
Mm.
which I think is um, a natural thing for a lot of people. I think a lot of people feel that there's a sense in which the person's going through it. You don't want to make them cry. You don't want to set them off. You don't want to make things worse. And
Yeah.
so there's this sort of fear in relating to people who are suffering. And I think that's something I've certainly learned,
Mm.
that your presence is more important than anything else.
Mm.
Not saying something is worse than saying something pretty much every time. Um, and so, yeah, just keeping it simple, sympathizing, but nothing crazy. And I certainly think that that's been a huge learning curve for me coming out of this.
Mm. I know you mentioned this a little earlier, but your husband, I know in his book mentioned he had a terror for a period of like the what if. Like
Mm.
as soon as you can see what God is capable of doing, it's like, whoa, for all I know, it might become like Job and I lose everything and I boils and like I could lose everything at one time. Um, and yet he also was kind of making this distinction of like he was afraid of God, and yet there was also this like holy fear of God in the sense of wow, he's really all powerful that he can do this. Um, and I know for me, that's probably the hardest thing I face every day is the fears of the what ifs. Anything could happen to anyone I love, or I could, just fall down dead sometime, whatever. How did you experience that fear similar to your husband? And like, how do you work through that? Because the what ifs can just feel so overwhelming.
So yes, I don't know that anyone who has lost a child, everyone I've talked to goes through that. It's too real. And I don't know that I figured out how to deal with it well yet, to be honest with you.
Hmm.
It's it's something that it's not a constant presence, but if I don't get a text message back fast enough, then I can panic. Not always, but I can panic. And I think it's just going to be a lifelong process. And it's not that I don't trust God. I'm just afraid of what he still will do, could potentially do. And so, yeah, I don't have a good answer for that one yet. I think it's
Mm,
better than it used to be. Um, but I think it's going to be a very long process of figuring out
mm.
what that looks like moving
And you said
forward.
it's better than it used to be. What did it used to be like?
It was just more present. So I would say that I'm not getting as in that panicked state, quote unquote, panic state as often anymore. I'm able to let it go longer if I don't hear from her or either of the girls, Nick's fiance too, because we still have contact with her. So it's all kind of wrapped up. So I would say it's lengthening, thankfully, but it's still not gone by any stretch of the imagination.
Okay.
So
Is that why you were saying Psalm 23? Is it specifically when it talks about the Lord being your shepherd that's encouraging to you? Or is it like walking through the valley of the shadow of death that's like very real?
it's walking through the valley of the shadow of death, which is very real.
Mm.
It's just a very sweet reminder of his presence um, despite death, despite the difficulty. You
And
are with me, your rod and staff, they comfort me, right? That whole part about the word comforting you as well.
um, when you say that God is good, and that is what scripture says, and you see the hardship you've been through, the hardship that other people have been through, um, like what does that mean to you? Like personally, like the truth is that God is good. And yet you can say that freely and fully, even experiencing hardship that doesn't seem very good. Um,
Sure. Wasn't sure if you're going to add something onto that.
no, go ahead. You've
I
got it.
think
Go.
the thing, so when I was writing, I had a lot of thank you notes to write. People were so unbelievably kind. I had a notebook full of names, and I would sit down and every single letter I signed, at the end of it, I would say, God is still good. And it wasn't so much for the people I was sending it to, but it was my reminder for myself that,
Mm.
okay, God is still good. God is still good. God is still good. And so that sort of became a mantra through the initial period, I think. And ultimately, the reason I can still say that is because he provided Jesus Christ, his son, and gave us hope beyond this world for heaven, right? And so I think that is the crux of why he is still good is that he gave us all of this stuff on earth. He gave us suffering and sorrow, but he also provided us with eternal life and hope in Christ. And so that is why God is still good.
Mhm. What right now, um, in the season you're in currently, what are you finding that the Lord is talking to you about or you're growing in right now in this current period?
So this is actually, you've caught me in probably the most difficult 2 years of my year because we're leading up to 2 weeks before Nick passed away. Um, So in terms of like a small picture, it's just a hard season and it's one that you sort of have to get through, to be honest with you. It's everything's just a little more real this time of year leading up until the day. The day itself so far hasn't been too bad, oddly enough. It's like the anticipation is worse than the reality.
Yeah.
Um, but so yeah, in terms of I'm just sort of hanging on at the moment, to be honest with you, through these next few weeks. Um, I think it's a new season of life for us. Our youngest has just left for college. So we are learning all sorts of new things about empty nesting and what it looks like. And we're just trying to, and Tim's been traveling a ton with work at the moment. So we're just sort of in the season where we're trying to figure out what our next
Hmm.
chunk of time is going to look like. What am I going to focus on? I've had a ton of conviction lately that I'm wanting to invest a little more heavily in some of the women in our church,
Hmm.
in large part because I'm going to have more time now. And I think it's also a really good responsibility for older women to start just in some of that investment within the ladies within the church as well. So, uh, and I mean, the Lord is always working on me in terms of humility and patience. It's just a granted for me. There's so much sanctification to be done in so many different areas of life still. But humility and patience is definitely two that he's working on, which I'm thankful for.
And you're talking about working with women. What particular way? Like counseling, or is it like mentoring, or
No,
source?
nothing formal, to be honest with you. I find I'm not, so I generally do children's ministry. I do early years stuff at our church. So I don't do a ton of women's ministry. And so formal women's ministry is something I've never really felt particularly called to do. But I think just making sure I'm forming good relationships with women. So nothing super formal, just having women into my home, spending time talking with them, making them help me make dinner one night and go grocery shopping. Basic life skills that I think sometimes the younger women don't necessarily have as well. Um, and just sort of, yeah, just being deliberate in their lives, I think is something that I've just been a little more convicted that I probably need to do a little bit better with.
Hmm. Well, I know you were mentioning you didn't like cooking at one point. Did you grow in a desire of like hospitality in the sense of like serving
So
people?
I grew up in a household that like when you did hospitality, you kind of went all out. So that part of it's never been hard for me. I've never, but I didn't know how to cook when I got married. I had absolutely no clue. And so the cooking part, like I like to cook now. I go through seasons. So sometimes I love to cook, sometimes I really hate it. But I generally do enjoy cooking now. And so that's something that's definitely grown through my marriage. My husband's pleased. It's not the
Oh,
way it
that's
used
always
to
a
be.
great determiner, right?
Not the way it used to be. So it's really bad when I was first married.
Yeah, no, I get it. I recently married myself almost a year, and I can tell if he likes it if he has a second. If he doesn't have a second, then I know he didn't like it that much.
Right. And then that recipe goes in the bin, right?
Yeah, or I'm like, you know what? I kind of liked it, so maybe I'll just
Yeah,
make it for
there's
him.
that.
Yeah, later. But then the last thing I want to ask you, because I really appreciate your time, is if you want to encourage a young person, older person, whoever who's going through grief, any type of grief really, how would you encourage them to walk through that right now?
So first and foremost, it's be patient with yourself. I think I was so frustrated at times. 'Cause I'm like, I'm so tired of crying. Like, I'm kind of over this. I think just give yourself grace and be patient because you want you want it to be done, and it's not going to be done for a very, very, very long time. And it will get easier, but it never will be better. And so learning how I think what we're given is we learn how to cope with it. It doesn't vanish.
Hmm.
And so those two things. Some of the best advice I got were things like the grief fog is normal, which that was just so strange to me. I would go shopping and buy the most randomly odd things, and it made no sense. And yet when somebody comes to you and tells you, no, no, that's okay and that's normal, that was super helpful to me.
Mm.
So very practical. I do better with practical. The other thing, honestly, that helped me a ton was Randy Alcorn's book, Heaven. I needed to know where Nick was. And so even if you don't necessarily agree with all the points in the book, it was helpful to me to have some sense. And it just gave me a great deal of comfort and sort of because I had
Mhm.
never sort of looked into that at all before. Um, yeah, so I think those are the sort of big points. Some people find it hugely helpful to be talking to somebody through it. Other people aren't, and I don't think either is correct. Um, so it just sort of depends on who you are as a person,
Mm.
but also just be very aware. I think it's important to know where your limits are. And so I'm trying to remember the phrase. Somebody gave us a phrase where you don't necessarily need counseling unless you hit a certain point and then you need to look into counseling. So not everybody who goes through grief is necessarily going to need counseling, but if you're not coping well with it, then you definitely do need to be open to that as well.
Mm.
And I think it's a level of functioning. Like if you're crying every day, that's pretty normal, but if you can't get out of bed, that's not. So those kind of general lines, I don't want to say specifically because I'm not a counselor, so somebody might be able to speak better to that than I would. But just trying to be a little aware of that, or have people around you who are aware of that enough.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. Thank you so much.